She drew the picture very quickly and gave it to me. When I looked at it, I noticed there was a third person in the drawing. And I said, "That's so nice of you to decide to include your brother." She said, "I didn't. It's just you and me." I looked at the picture and noticed there was clearly a third face in the picture drawn over my left shoulder. I pointed to the face she had drawn and said, "Olivia, I can see him right here." I pointed to the face next to me and she said, "Oh, that's not my brother. That's your friend." My stomach dropped because what in the world does that mean? She went on to insist that someone came with me sometimes when I showed up to watch them during the day. She said she often saw them over my shoulder, and the person didn't really say or do anything, just kind of hung around. Hello and welcome back to Chillers and Thrillers. I am your host, Em, and in this podcast, I read true stories of people's encounters with the strange and unexplained. No comedy, skepticism, or gore, only 100% true spooky tales. First, a special thank you to new Patreon subscribers, Mira and Daph. Your support means a lot and it helps keeps the podcast going. You can join the Patreon for $3 a month or for free to stay up to date on upcoming episodes and join our spooky community. This episode is part 2 of the series about children and their connection to the paranormal. Last episode, I recounted true stories of people or their children who recalled past lives. And in this episode, I'll be recounting true stories of people who encountered the paranormal as children or via their children. As I mentioned last episode, children seem to have an acute connection to the spiritual realm. There's a variety of theories as to why children have this special connection. Skeptics often say that children aren't really seeing ghosts, they just have a skewed view of fantasy and reality and the line is blurred until they become old enough to differentiate. But many people who believe in the supernatural have different theories. As I mentioned last episode, some people believe because children are so young from the spiritual realm, they have this special connection and are still tethered to the spiritual world. There's also some theories that because children are so little, their pineal gland isn't fully developed. The pineal gland is a specific gland in the deep center of the brain. It's also referred to as the third eye, for many reasons, including its location deep in the center of the brain and its connection to light via the circadian rhythm and melatonin secretion. But in spiritual traditions, people believe it serves as a connection between the physical and spiritual worlds. The pineal gland tends to calcify as people get older, and some spiritualists theorize that because in children their pineal gland are still fresh, they can still see spirits. Sometimes, in children's innocence, what we would consider a spirit, children would consider an imaginary friend. This episode is also a story swap with the I Scream, You Scream podcast, where Gina and Kathryn share a weekly scoop of the most chilling histories, mysteries, and paranormal perplexities. I'll be sharing some of Kathryn's personal experiences with children in the paranormal, and make sure to check out their podcasts as they have some great creepy stories and mysteries. I've linked their show in this episode's notes. I will also be telling a story from my mother's side of the family. This is a true story that scared every person who experiences it, and it still sends chills down my spine to this day. Now, let's not waste any more time. So turn down the lights, get comfortable, and listen in. Before we get started with our stories, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave me a comment. What was your favorite childhood costume that you wore for Halloween? Kathryn's stories from the I Scream, You Scream podcast. When I was in about 2nd or 3rd grade, I was sitting at the kitchen counter just casually chatting with my parents, brother, and my brother's friend before dinner. I think I was coloring or doing an activity or something like that because I was not really paying attention to what was going on. It was relatively cool for a summer evening, so all the windows were open, but there was no breeze. I mentioned the lack of breeze because all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we hear the back door swing open, then slowly fall closed. Everyone stopped talking and looked around confused. My mom said, "What in the world was that?" and went over into the laundry room where the back door was to check to see if anyone was there, but no one was. Without looking up from whatever I was working on, I casually said, "Don't worry, it was just Grandpa stopping in to check in on us." My parents were silent and just looked at each other. What I didn't know at the time was that that day was the anniversary of the day my mom's dad died several years prior, before my brother and I were even born. Story 2. I worked as a nanny for several years when I lived in Chicago about 10 years ago. The family I worked for had 2 kids, a girl who was 5 at the time, and the boy who was 3. We'll call them Olivia and Caden. One day, after preschool, we were just sitting around doodling. She and her brother had gone into an argument, so I separated them. He was in the living room playing with his toys, and she was at the kitchen table with a random pad of paper, making pretend notes and doodling sketches. Just kind of flipping through this pad and doing a quick random thing on each page. Think rapid-fire art. At one point, she said, "I'm going to draw you and me together, not Caden." She was still clearly angry at him, and I just said, "Great, love it, I'll keep it forever," and continued doing whatever I was doing in the kitchen. She drew the picture very quickly and gave it to me. When I looked at it, I noticed there was a third person in the drawing, and I said, "That's so nice of you to decide to include your brother." She said, "I didn't. It's just you and me." I looked at the picture and noticed there was clearly a third face in the picture drawn over my left shoulder. I pointed to the face she had drawn and said, "Olivia, I can see him right here." I pointed to the face next to me and she said, "Oh, that's not my brother. That's your friend." My stomach dropped because what in the world does that mean? So I pressed a little further to see who she could have been talking about. She went on to insist that someone came with me sometimes when I showed up to watch them during the day. She said she often saw them over my shoulder, and the person didn't really say or do anything, just kind of hung around. I tried to ask if that person was good or bad, nice or scary, but by that point, she was completely disinterested in the conversation and seemed bored with my questions, so I had no choice but to just move on. There were several other instances where she would draw strange-looking creatures and refer to them as her friends, but the topic of the friend who came with me sometimes never really came up, even if I tried to ask. Kathryn was nice enough to include the picture that Olivia drew for her, and if you'd like to see it, check out the podcast Instagram and YouTube. The Tree Girl, submitted by my mom. When I was a young girl, I lived in the state of Paraíba in the northeast of Brazil. My family is made up of generations of farmers, and my great-grandfather and grandfather owned the largest farm in the family. It was similar to a compound, with my uncles and other relatives living on the property and working alongside one another while raising their families. All the homes on this farm were haunted, and everyone experienced something strange. At the time, I had a young cousin named Louisa who was around 7 years old. Since we were all family, the adults would allow us to play and run around the farm and property because they knew we were safe, and my cousin would frequently be seen sitting under a specific tree. She looked like she was talking to herself, and she just started to tell us and her parents about a girl who sat in the tree and talked to her. At first, everyone brushed it off because she was young and they assumed she had an imaginary friend. Over time, she would spend more and more time under the tree talking to this girl. At this time, we had no electricity on the property, so there was no televisions or radios, and Louisa was not in school yet. But she would frequently sing old children's songs that she would have had no way of knowing. No one in the family had heard it before, and when she was questioned about it, she would say that the girl in the tree taught her the song. Over time, Louisa started to tell her parents that she wanted to die. She wanted to die so she could join her friend forever. This obviously alarmed her parents, and her father, my uncle, decided that enough was enough and he was going to cut the tree down. The climate in Paraíba can be very dry and arid, so cutting down a perfectly healthy tree was almost unheard of. But the family was spooked, and her parents could not risk losing her. My uncle cut down the tree, and Louisa was devastated. It took her a very long time to get over her grief, but she never saw the girl again. Kaylee, submitted by user Sandy Neutron. I've had sleep issues for as long as I can remember, and at its worst, it turns into bouts of sleep paralysis. It was at its peak the first time I lived without any other adults in my early 20s. The insomnia led to regular episodes of sleep paralysis, which in turn made the insomnia worse, and so on and so forth. During this time, my daughter was about 4 years old and had an imaginary friend named Kaylee. She'd talk about Kaylee coming along with us when we go out, and I could hear her carry conversations with her over tea parties. She often called her Kaylee, whose parents died a long time ago. Weird, but not too crazy. But my mom, a very religious old-school Mexican woman, would tell me not to let my daughter keep talking to her because that's one of the ways the devil tries to lure people. I didn't pay too much mind given that this was not the first time I've heard my mom reference something common as being of the devil, but I did make a point not to engage too much when it came to Kaylee. One evening, I fell asleep on the couch in my living room and started feeling like I was spinning into it, a telltale sign of a bout of sleep paralysis. It usually starts off feeling like I'm simultaneously pinned down and being sucked into the couch or bed, and lasts for anywhere between a few seconds and a few minutes. It breaks as soon as I'm able to move, so I usually focus all of my attention on moving a finger. This particular night, around 1 a.m., I'm lying on my couch, stuck staring straight up at the ceiling. To my right, my vision is blocked by the back of the couch. And to my left, I can see a figure standing inches away from my face, just watching me. I can't turn my head, but I can see out of my peripheral that it's a little girl, and she's wearing a red hoodie zipped up. She's around my daughter's height and has light brown hair with a few strands coming out of the hood over her head. I start panicking, desperately trying to move any single part of me or scream, but I can't. And I'm also terrified of looking her straight on. It lasts for less than a minute, and right before I'm able to move, she walks away. I shoot up straight, covered in sweat, and immediately run into my daughter's bedroom where she's sleeping soundly in her PJs. I stayed up the rest of the night standing in her doorway because I was too terrified to fall back asleep. And from then on, we started spending most nights over at my parents' house. A few months later, we moved out of that condo. My daughter never mentioned Kaylee after the move, and I've always been too afraid to ask what she looked like. Baby Visitor, submitted by user Soroto60. This happened to me when I was a young child. My mom's side of the family has always been sensitive, being more in tune with sensing the dead. Because of that, we notice more paranormal activity going on around us than most. Since I can remember, I was always having some sort of paranormal experiences. The most disturbing one from my childhood happened when I was living in the inner city of Kansas City, my hometown. It was a 2-bedroom duplex, and we lived on the second floor. I shared a room with my brother, who was just over a year old and was still in a crib. Most of the time we spent there was without incident, but I remember one night, I woke up in the middle of the night to witness a tall man standing in the space between my open door and the wall behind the door. He was roughly the same height as the door. I was frightened at the sight of an unknown man in my room, so I went to do the go-to move any kid would use to get rid of scary things in the dark. I pulled the cover over my head. Once I pulled the cover off, he was gone. I chalked it up to my imagination and went back to sleep. But it wasn't my imagination. For the next month or so, I would wake up in the middle of the night and see the exact same man standing there. He never looked at me, just stared intently at the door. Every time I went to do my go-to move of pulling the covers over my head and then back, he would disappear. But after a month or so, he made his move. One night, I woke up to see him in his usual spot, but this time, he finally moved. He stepped through the door, and I finally got to see him in full view. He was a tall, white male, looked to be in his 30s or 40s, very slender. He kind of looked like former U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. He wore a dark fedora and had dark, circular glasses. He had dark overalls with a white and red striped sweater and knee-high white socks. After standing in full view for a few seconds, he began to slowly walk towards my brother's crib, which was on the other side of the door he had been standing behind, along the wall. He then bent over and reached into my brother's crib. Then he disappeared. This was the last time I saw him, but it started a string of other paranormal experiences that I experienced in the duplex. After we moved from the place, I became more attuned to the paranormal. I never told my parents about this until years later, when we figured out the house we moved into after the duplex was haunted by the previous tenant. The story still gives my mom chills to this day whenever she's reminded of it. Imagine how I feel. The Old Man in the Shed, submitted by user Chaotic Eva. This happened maybe 5 years ago, in June or July, summer for sure. My sister and her kids came over to visit, and she and I were out on our deck drinking beer while the kids played inside because it had AC. We're just idling away the time, chit-chatting and such, while my husband does some yard work. It's summer, so long days. It's nearly 9 and just getting dark. As dusk progresses into full-on night, my husband is a mere shadow, shifting and shunting things around back by the shed. Ours is a pretty big yard, a little over half an acre, so he's kind of hard to see now. Then we hear the door open at our backs and think it's one of our kids, and given the mature subject matter we'd been cackling about, we simultaneously yelled at them to go back inside. "Why?" my husband asked. We whirled in our chairs to look at him, then whirled back around and peered in the direction of the shed. Abruptly, we stood up and backed up behind him, pointing and babbling that someone was back there, someone we thought was him. He snatched up a bat and called out, "Hey!" I ran inside to get flashlights while he started across the lawn. My sister was yelling at me to hurry up. I caught up to him as he dithered a bit midway. I looked up at him, and his jaw was set, but he didn't proceed. "What is it?" I asked. I looked towards the shed again and wondered why we didn't have one of those glaring perimeter lights. It was so dark. All of a sudden, my husband cries out, and I scream, and I can hear my sister scream. And then my husband is telling me to go inside and call the police. He stays out by the deck, pacing, tense, with the bat gripped tightly in both hands. The kids are peering out by the window, murmuring about how the old man is back there again. "Old man? What are you guys talking about?" my sister and I ask. I immediately think maybe a vagrant. "He lives under the shed, Mom," the youngest said, "but he usually only comes out if you're alone." The cops get there. My husband walks them down to the shed and they look around, go inside the shed, check the crawl space underneath. The officers and my husband walked along the length of the 6-foot wooden fence, but found nothing. Our yards back up to a large wooded lot, and they peered over, but after shining their lights around a bit, they left. My sister and her kids left, I put my kids to sleep, and then I walked back down to the hall to the living room. My husband was at the window looking out, but before I could say anything, he said, "I saw that old man the kids talk about." "What old man?" I hiss, and I'm super upset because I'm scared. He muttered something, then said, "I'm burning it down. I've always felt creeped out back there anyway. It's why I came inside early before it got dark. I did see something. I don't know what it was, but I'm not going to be afraid in my own backyard." The next day, at the crack of dawn, he called his brothers up. They moved his tools into the garage and demoed the shed. Then they had a big bonfire, and now there's no shed and no old man. Uncle Andrew, submitted by user Melonians. I didn't believe in ghosts until this day, but it's fair to say that now I have a slightly more open mind. My 2 to 3-year-old daughter was playing on her own, but like she was playing hide and seek with an imaginary friend. I asked her, "Are you playing hide and seek?" And she said yes. When I asked, "Who are you playing with?" she said, "Uncle Andrew." My wife's brother Andrew was 7 when he drowned, and my wife was 5. She doesn't like to talk about it, so we had never mentioned it in front of my daughter. Grandpa, submitted by Anonymous. My daughter, when she was 3, used to talk about her imaginary friend all the time. She'd say he was big and fun and spent a lot of time playing with her. One day, I was scanning old photos and had a photo of my father on my desk, and she said, "Hey, how'd you get a photo of my friend?" I instantly got shivers down my spine. My father died in the house 15 years previously, and she played in a room that used to be his office. I cautiously asked her to tell me more about her friend, and without hesitating, she told me he talks funny. The chills stopped me dead in my tracks, because my dad was an Aussie who never lost his accent. Ghost Girl, submitted by user Not Yours to Love. This happened when I was around 7 and living in a small farm town outside of Chicago. Each night I'd go to bed, and from the ceiling above me, a little girl, in the shape of a shadow, would watch me. I recall she had curly, untamed hair and no facial features, but she definitely read as a little girl around my age. I told my very religious mother about this, and at first she said it must be my guardian angel. She also told me not to stay up late reading books with the light on, that it does things to my head. I was confused by that because I never read books at night. I figured it couldn't be all bad as the little shadow girl never did anything to me. She never even spoke to me. After a few months, though, I started to have terrible dreams. I'd go to sleep and see horrific car accidents, scenes, and murders, a man inviting me to go into a maze with him, or a large, angry person chasing after me. As the chaser dropped their hands on my shoulder, something would pry my eyes open, and I'd suddenly be awake in my bed, staring up at the little shadow girl. I started to think something might be up with her. I'd scream and cry and ask my mom to sleep with me, but she didn't want to. My father told me the little girl was just a reflection in the window or a figment of my imagination. They both tired of me talking about her. The shadow girl watched me until I was probably 9 or 10 years old. Then she gradually faded into the ceiling where she came from, and I didn't think of her for years. Over time, I chalked her presence up to my wildly out-of-control imagination. In my 20s, my brother and I decided to go back to the home where we'd grown up to visit. A family we'd known from town had purchased it, so they were happy to invite us in and let us check out the old haunt again. When we got to what had been my room, the mother of the new family became, for the very first time, very sheepish and was hesitant to let us in. She mumbled something about bad spirits and this is the room they don't use. I suspected she may have had an encounter with the shadow girl, and I laughingly said, "Wait, have you guys seen the ghost girl too?" The woman's face drained of color. "That's no ghost," she said. She told me she'd seen the shadow girl in my former room, mostly, but also walking around the house and into the children's bedrooms at night. The woman had called her psychic sister-in-law to do a mini exorcism, and the sister-in-law had not gotten rid of the spirit entirely, but had relegated her to this room. At the time, the sister-in-law had jokingly called the spirit a soul hunter. At this point, I wasn't freaked out so much as amused. I also felt justified that I hadn't been imagining things all those years ago. When I got home, I called my mom to let her know there had been a ghost girl who'd watched me, and the new family friend had corroborated my experience. During this time, my mom became shifty and obtuse, and I sensed there was something that she hadn't been telling me. I pressed my mother to tell me what was up. My mother said that back then there had been several nights where she'd walk past my door at night and see this unusually bright light coming from the sides and beneath my door. For a time, she thought it was just me with my light on reading my American Girl doll series or something, and ignored it. But then, when I started talking about the little girl, she'd become more curious. One night, after seeing this light, she peered into my room and saw a giant, glowing orb floating over my body. It wasn't a car light or a reflection. This was some kind of mini planet standing guard over my body. And the next moment I had shot up, suddenly awake, and she'd run to comfort me and tell me to go back to sleep. Since this hadn't been a shadow, she, being deeply religious, assumed that I'd mistaken a friendly angel for a ghost. But now, both her and I are convinced that whatever she saw protecting me from the little shadow girl, who was not a girl at all, and every moment I'd shoot up suddenly, awaken from whatever horrific nightmare I'd been having, it was that orb thing pulling back from some predator in a dream. Mr. Rand, submitted by Anonymous. Okay, backstory time. When I was a kid, Mr. Rand used to come into my room 4 or 5 times a week. He talked to me and tell me stuff and how he was killed in World War II. See, my old mate Rand was a figment of my 4-year-old imagination. Anyway, one day when I was 9 or so, Mr. Rand stopped showing up. Fast forward to about 3 years ago, and my son, who was about 5 at the time, walks out of his room one night at about 11:30 and says there's a man in his room. I flip out and run into his room and find nobody, to which he then says, "Mr. Rand said you can't see him anymore, but he's okay." Courtney, submitted by user Annie CB. We lived in a house on 6 acres of wooded, swampy land with our 2-year-old son. One day, after a ride through the woods with my husband, my son started talking about Courtney. We didn't know anyone with that name, so we figured it was just an imaginary friend. But then, he started saying that Courtney was a little girl who was trapped under the swamp and was never rescued. Courtney never came into our house, but whenever our son was playing outside, he would walk right over to the trees and talk to her. We moved out of the house 2 years later, and our son was hysterically upset that Courtney was still trapped in that swamp. Striped t-shirt. Submitted by user Met Marie Palakis. When I was younger, I used to dream about a little boy who lived in our bathroom who wore a striped blue and white t-shirt. It didn't feel like a nightmare because he would just make small talk while I was on the toilet, but I told my parents about it because it was weird to keep having that same dream. Well, years later, my sister and 5-year-old niece visited our house, and my niece needed to go to the bathroom. We had been waiting for her for 5 minutes when my sister jokingly asked if she had gotten stuck. When my niece finally came out of the bathroom, she said, "Sorry, I was talking to the boy in the striped t-shirt." We all looked at each other, thinking the exact same thing. And that's all for this episode. Really hope you enjoyed these stories. If you get a chance, I'd love for you to leave a comment on Spotify, Patreon, or YouTube. Best of all, please remember to share with your paranormally inclined friends and family and leave a rating or review when possible. When this episode releases, it is officially the start of Spooky Month. I'm really excited about this year's Halloween-themed episode, and I'm hoping to drop a bonus episode in October as well. And if you have any stories you'd like to share with me that you would like to be featured in the podcast, please feel free to email me at chillersandthrillers@gmail.com. In the meantime, I hope all you ghouls and ghosts stay safe, and I'll see you soon.